So The Rock has named the three GOATs, greatest of all times, of WWE. We're gonna go check it out. I haven't read this article yet, so let's go peep it. Sup y'all, welcome back to the review space. Yes, we are gonna check out this particular Wrestling Inc. Article. It's got almost 1,000 comments. You know, usually these Wrestling Inc. articles, they got maybe 20, 30 comments. Some of the more controversial ones can get maybe up to over 100 comments, but this one has 947 comments as I'm currently looking at it right now. And so it's almost like nearly 1,000. So obviously it caused some level of controversy. The Rock naming the three GOATs of WWE. Let's go check it out. What does this guy even have to say, you know? I mean, first of all, okay, hold on. Before we even get into the article, the three GOATs it's such a limited number. I mean, there's different names. You can name certain greats in each period. You can say the 60s, 70s, Bruno Sammartino. He was the biggest star. He reigned as champion for like 11 years. You know, his first title reign was like 7.5 years or 8 years, something like that. The 80s would be Hogan, easily, because, I mean, he dominated for 4 years. And I guess in between you could say somebody like a Bob Backlund. You know, but guys like Backlund, Sammartino, a superstar Billy Graham, these kind of guys, Pedro Morales, they reigned for years, but they were regional stars. They were more regional. It was more because WWF and WWF in the early 80s it wasn't exactly national yet, you know, and it certainly wasn't international. It was just regional. You got that East Coast, you know, New York region, and it was hot over there, and I'm sure there was a certain amount of success that especially somebody like a Bruno Sammartino had, and Bob Backlund, these guys that were on top for years and years, but like in terms of becoming nationally known and international, I would say Hogan in the 80s, and then throughout the I guess the 90s, it'd have to be guys like Undertaker to a certain degree, guys like Stone Cold, The Rock. You know, I would have to look at those guys like the biggest stars that the company ever had. So it really depends on what kind of superstar you're looking for. If you're looking for just pure commercial success, pure mainstream success, Hulk Hogan, The Rock, and Stone Cold. Like, to me, those were the three biggest crossover stars that the company has ever produced. That's ever been like WWE superstars. You know what I'm saying? The Rock was so popular in the Attitude Era. Stone Cold was probably even a little bit ahead of him. You know, at least initially in 1998. You know, that was like the hottest year in sports entertainment ever. Between WWF and WCW and even ECW. Like, pro wrestling was so freaking hot and it was so popular back in 98. And those guys were on top. Guys like Goldberg, guys like The Rock, guys like Stone Cold, they were like at the very top of the mainstream. So, you know, and then of course you have guys like Hogan in the 80s who really had that crossover appeal, that charisma, that larger-than-life personality, that MTV personality where you could put him in movies, you could put him in commercials, you know, and he'd be recognizable. You know, Hulk Hogan, one of the most recognizable stars ever. It may be number one of all time in pro wrestling. So if you're talking about the three greatest of all time, just in terms of pure mainstream, like super popularity, getting over, getting super hyper popular, those guys would be up there. I'm not even like familiar with like guys from the past. Guys like I think what's the name? Jim Londos. You know, back in the day, back in the olden days, I think you know, decades and decades ago, it was guys like Jim Londos. You know, the Greek Superman or whatever. You know, he was like super popular. You know, a handsome wrestling star, one of the biggest draws of his time back in the day. You know, so certain guys were big stars for their time, even before Hogan came along. You know, of course, guys like Bruno Sammartino, guys like Ricky Dozen in Japan, guys like what's his name, Santo in Mexico. You know, certain guys that were very influential and highly popular in their time. You know, they defined a generation even before Hogan came along. You know, guys from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, you know, the biggest stars of that time. But it's really hard to gauge how big these guys were in comparison to somebody like a Hogan, who became like an international, recognized star. Guys like The Rock, the Rock now, he's in so many Hollywood movies. I would say The Rock became even more. The Rock's been in Hollywood way longer now than he ever was in WWF and in the WWE, which is really crazy to me. He became a huge star in the Attitude Era. But really, if you want to take a look at the years that he was there, like 96, late 96 when he came in, and then 97, 98, 99, all the way up to maybe about 2003, sporadically on and off, up to like 2004. But he's been in Hollywood since then, since like the early 2000s, ever since like, what's the first movie he did? I think it was The Mummy Returns and The Scorpion King. He started doing those movies, and then. And that's like the early 2K, like 2001, 2002. And now it's 2019 and he's still doing movies in 2019. He's been doing movies for like the past, 18 years, 17 years, something like that. So he's been in Hollywood a lot longer than his run, his continuous run in the WWE, which is absolutely nuts. But to me, That was his best run, was back when he was the People's Champion, The Rock, 98 Rock, 99, early 2000 Rock. That was one of the most imitated, one of the most popular wrestling stars ever. He was so cool back in the day. And his character got lamer over time by the early 2K, and he became a lot more of a comedy. He got watered down. He wasn't as funny anymore. He lost his hair, and he didn't look like an alpha male anymore. He came across more like almost like a joke. You could tell that the company was phasing him out. WWE was phasing him out. You could tell that the way that he would always lose to Triple H, he would always get buried. He would lose to so many different, up and coming stars. Like he lost a lot back when he was on his way out. So I think that damaged a lot of his lasting appeal. That damaged a lot of his legacy, I think. But The Rock to me is going to be one of the greatest ever anyway. He's, and I think a lot of his success is The Rock's Hollywood run is kind of mixed in with his wrestling run. People look at him as a wrestler or an ex-wrestler, but they also see him as a Hollywood guy. So his overall success gets kind of put in together, and I'll be honest with you, I don't care about The Rock's movies. I don't care about his Hollywood movies. If a movie comes out starring The Rock, I don't care. I do not give a damn about The Rock's movies. Like most of his movies, I do not care about. I don't go out to watch them in theaters. I don't buy the DVDs or Blu-ray. I don't even stream them on the internet. The only movie that I kind of halfway liked, that I even remotely enjoyed, was Gridiron Gang. I thought the Gridiron Gang was okay, and I think maybe at least one of the Fast and the Furious movies that he was in, which was kind of your typical schlocky, dime a dozen, kind of an action racing movie. I think maybe it was Fast 4, the fourth one, where the first time that he came in, and he had that little brawl with Vin Diesel. I thought that was okay, but I again, like, these movies are not outstanding, so I don't care much for his Hollywood run. I don't really care about his movies, Hercules and, what's his other crappy movies? The Scorpion King and Doom and Escape to Witch Mountain and Be Cool and all this corny stuff, these terrible movies and all the the garbage that he's been in. Like, half of the movies that he's in, I don't even like. I have no clue, and I have no interest in watching The Rock's movies. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's so, Baywatch, the little, crappy Baywatch film based on the 90s TV show. You know what I'm saying? This up-and-coming Roman Reigns thing. I mean, with Roman Reigns, I'm curious to kind of see how well he performs in a movie. What is it? What is it? Hobbs and Shaw. Hobbs and Shaw is the Fast and the Furious spin-off that's up and coming with The Rock. So, it could be interesting just because Roman Reigns is in it, and I've never seen him in a movie or do any kind of acting in Hollywood. So that is something to want to check it out. That sounds kind of interesting. But The Rock, I just don't care about him. And the guy's like 50. You know, he's pushing 50 years old. He's up there in age. He's not like a young, hot young superstar stud that's like taking over Hollywood. He's been there for almost 20 years. You know what I'm saying? So I don't care about The Rock doing his thing in Hollywood. I just don't care about his movies. He's nowhere near as charismatic when it comes to movies like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, some people. I remember when he first started doing movies, and people compared him to Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, oh, this guy's going to be the next Arnie. He's going to be the next Schwarzenegger, and it's like not even close. You take a look at Arnold Schwarzenegger's entire movie history, like his greatest movies, his filmography. You take his catalog of great films, and yeah, he had a lot of bad films too. But Arnie, his awesome classic movies, you put that against The Rock's movies, it's not even close. You know, Arnie's movies destroy The Rock's entire catalog. You know what I'm saying? Arnold Schwarzenegger, the original Total Recall. You know what I'm saying? Terminator 1, Terminator 2. You know, classics. These sci-fi action classics. Even his lesser critically acclaimed stuff like Last Action Hero and, Predator was really good. You know, Predator, another classic. You know what I'm saying? True Lies. You know what I'm saying? Like, he had a lot of, like, really solid movies. You know, just really entertaining films. You know, yeah, again, he had some crappy movies, too, like End of Days and what's what is that? The one with Turbo Man? Put That Cookie Down. What is that one? I think it's called Jingle All the Way, but I can't even remember. I think I remember seeing that in theaters when I was a kid. That movie stunk so bad, but yeah. And of course, Batman and Robin and all that. These really campy, terrible movies. So yeah, Arnie was in a lot of bad movies too, but it's like he was also in some really solid, really memorable films. Conan the Barbarian. How can I forget the Conan movies and all that? So, Arnie did his thing. He's got a solid legacy, great collection of movies. The Rock, I can't say the same thing about The Rock's films. You know what I'm saying? Like, well, what classics does The Rock have in Hollywood? What's his classics? Again, Gridiron Gang was okay. What, the Fast and the Furious movie? Is that it? Is that it? I think he did like a weightlifting movie with that racist Mark Wahlberg. Yes, he is a racist. He ended up assaulting a bunch of minorities back in the late 80s. That guy is a piece of trash, Mark Wahlberg. But anyway, yeah, he did a movie with him. He did a movie that some crappy like Disney movies. He did Be Cool. He did a crappy Scorpion King mummy movies. Those were bad. So I'm trying to think of a classic movie that is like this incredibly must-see. I think he did a G.I. Joe movie. So The Rock's film career is a joke. It's an absolute joke. I think a few years ago, many years ago, maybe back in 2012, so this goes back maybe about 7 years ago, I compared The Rock and Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel won by a landslide. He had way better films and just way better entertainment media than The Rock when it comes to movies and video game, even something like video games. And of course The Rock had good video games too, if you want to count the wrestling games. What I'm saying? WrestleMania 2000, those kind of titles, those games from, the WWE games, basically. But, I mean, those are wrestling games and, But as far as, like, I mean, Vin Diesel had, like, Chronicles of Riddick video games. He had the Chronicles of Riddick movies. He had a lot of classic, like, awesome, like, fun little movies, like Triple X and Pitch Black and, even, like, smaller movies like Boiler Room. And, he even, like, his debut movie was this critically acclaimed movie, award-winning movie called Saving Private Ryan. He had a little part in that. He had a voice acting role in The Iron Giant, another kind of a cult movie from I think that was the late 90s. So Vin Diesel's been in some tremendous work. I would say Vin is a lot closer to Arnold Schwarzenegger than The Rock. The Rock is more like... like a modern day, like crappy, like, I'm trying to, like maybe a Van Damme, like a crappier version of like a Schwarzenegger, like not as interesting, or maybe even not even a Van Damme, because Van Damme's more of a, he's like a wannabe martial artist kind of guy. You know, he's like a crappier Bruce Lee, or a crappier Chuck well, maybe not even Chuck Norris, but he's just a crappier like martial arts movie actor. But somebody like The Rock is he's just a crappier version of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like that's really what he is. Somebody who's just not that great. His films are not that interesting. But anyway, I kind of went off on a completely different tangent there, talking about his movies. But I'm just the point that I'm trying to get at is that The Rock's films, they're really not that great, but people kind of see him as a big star because he's always there. He's in so many different movies. Hollywood loves him because I guess he's a big draw. You know, he'll go to China and film a movie. You know, he draws people. He puts butts in seats. He draws people to get people to want to pay money to see him and, you know, buy a ticket to see his movies, I guess. To me, I just don't care. You know what I'm saying? I think his movies are terrible. I have no desire to watch his movies. I preferred him way better as a wrestler back in the late 90s. That's The Rock in his prime. And he was amazing back then. I mean, definitely one of the greatest pro wrestling characters ever. Okay, so let's get to this GOAT thing. I know I went off on a completely different tangent for, what is it, how long did I ramble about his movies for? What is it, 16 minutes, my god. Okay, so just quickly try to get to what The Rock mentioned. The Rock took to Instagram today and declared the 3 GOATs, greatest of all time, to be WWE Hall of Famers: Hogan, Ric Flair, and Steve Austin. Wow. Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, and Stone Cold. I mean, that's not a bad list. Austin was the face of 90s wrestling, especially late 90s Attitude Era, when it was super hot. Ric Flair is like the quintessential, you know, he can wrestle, he's good in the ring, he's great on the mic, very charismatic character, tons of charisma. Very likable, very great heel, you know, and he was willing to put over other guys. He was willing to work with talented people. He was willing to make his opponents look good. And he became champion over and over and over again because he was so good at it. He was a traveling champion. He was willing to defend it anywhere. You know, he'll go to Korea. He'll go to the Caribbeans. He'll go everywhere around the world. He'll wrestle anywhere where he has to defend the world title. You know, he's a real traveling champion. You know what I'm saying? So Ric Flair definitely is one of the greatest of all time. He's definitely up there. Even though, yeah, he ripped off, you know, I think it was Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, and he ripped off a bunch of other wrestlers, you know, a bunch of other, flamboyant blonde characters with the figure 4 and his gimmick and all that, and the robe and everything. But Ric Flair is still... He was incredible for the 80s. The 80s really was... He was one of the defining, you know, greatest performers of the 1980s. And Hogan, of course, one of the biggest superstars ever. Hogan was just an international star. He was a larger-than-life, like a real-life superhero. He was so big and muscular and very charismatic, good promos, and, you know, just... He ticked all the boxes for being a superstar. You know, and he tried to go the Hollywood thing. You know, before The Rock and guys like Batista and John Cena and, you know, these guys that try to make it in Hollywood and are making it in Hollywood, it was Hulk Hogan. You know, back in the early 90s, he was trying to do, like, movies and TV shows in the early 90s. He wasn't even wrestling full-time yet. He was doing, like, Hollywood stuff. You know, he never really kind of made it in Hollywood. He never really became, like, He never had any hits. He never had any, like, super amazingly incredible movies. His movies were just kind of crappy, heavily panned movies, you know. It wasn't that great, so he kind of fizzled out in Hollywood, but, you know, he tried. They tried to make money off of him because he was so popular as a crossover, you know, star. So they tried with him, but it was really The Rock who became the one that really made the Hollywood thing work, even if it took a long time for The Rock to make it, and then guys like Batista and John Cena and maybe even Roman Reigns. So The Rock made the post in response to the 17th anniversary of his WrestleMania 18 match with the Hulkster, billed as the Icon versus Icon. Torch passed, grateful. This past weekend, WWE celebrated its 17th anniversary, yada yada yada. to determine who'd go down as the greatest of all time, it was yours truly versus the immortal Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. Rock wrote, "What made this match so special was that there was no heavyweight champion on the no heavyweight championship on the line. Just two men, just two careers, and 85,000 plus of the most insane electric crowd I have ever had the privilege to perform in front of. It was almost as if every single person that night in the Toronto Skydome made up their mind that they would give every ounce of energy they had because they knew this match was only going to be seen once in a lifetime." And I think that's when he was booed. They booed him over Hulk Hogan. They cheered Hogan over The Rock, and you know, it is what it is. You know, I think that Hogan, he just has a longer legacy than The Rock, and you know, I think in that crowd, that I think it was the Toronto crowd. The Toronto crowd, they appreciated Hogan more, you know, and they were longing for Hogan to be in WWE because he was in WCW for most of the 90s, like the mid-late 90s, so they gravitated more around Hogan, and a lot of these younger fans, or I'm sorry, a lot of the fans in the 2000s, a lot of them grew up in the 80s, you know what I'm saying? They were grown adults that grew up on the Hulkster, and The Rock was just kind of there, but he was kind of leaving for Hollywood, so they kind of saw The Rock as less than, he was lesser, you know, even though The Rock was so popular in his prime, he wasn't that cool anymore by like the 2003, 2002-ish. He was still popular, but he wasn't as entertaining anymore. And he was leaving for Hollywood. So, you know, I think generally the Toronto fans, they just didn't like The Rock as much. They were like, okay, we love Hogan more. You know, Hogan is our childhood hero, and The Rock is kind of like this guy who's maybe he's not as committed to wrestling, and he's kind of leaving, and you know, he's just not as big as Hogan in his prime, you know. So it's interesting. It's a very interesting pick, and The Rock seems very grateful about you know, the way that he spoke about the great of all time, the greatest of all time. He said, "These goats were good enough to recognize I had something to offer, and graciously passed the torch. Grateful. My friend and childhood hero Hulk Hogan passed the torch to me on this historic night, which decreed me becoming the greatest of all time." Rock continued, "But the truth is, to me, the GOAT are the three men below, who paved the way for me and so many others in pro wrestling: Hogan, Ric Flair, and Steve Austin. I just worked very hard, connected with the audience, and caught a break." So he put over Hogan, Flair, and Stone Cold Steve Austin. And you know what? It's hard to argue with that top three. I mean, it's really hard. It's very difficult because he worked with Stone Cold a lot, and Austin recognized The Rock's talent. You know, the two of them became friendly towards each other. They became friends. You can tell that they respected each other, and they were willing to work with each other. They were willing to have segments together and have matches together at WrestleMania and draw money together and make money together. So that's a very good thing. You know what I'm saying? The Rock respects Austin, and I'm sure Austin respects Rock. So there was that mutual friendship, that mutual, I'm willing to do business with this guy. I like this guy's talent, and you know, there's that mutual friendship. With Hogan was willing enough to put over The Rock, and so Hogan, I'm sure, saw The Rock as a big enough star, you know, unlike somebody like a Bret Hart, unfortunately, back in the early mid-90s, where he kind of saw Bret Hart as kind of less than him. You know, I don't want to put over Bret, you know, he's too small, or he's not that big of a superstar, he's not as big as me, so. And then, of course, somebody like Ric Flair, I'm sure The Rock saw Ric Flair as the one of the most entertaining, most incredible workers of all time. Very charismatic, with the shades and everything. So The Rock, I'm sure, was inspired and influenced. He was inspired and influenced by Ric Flair's work back in the 1980s. You know, he saw Ric Flair as a real champion, somebody that carried the belt with prestige, somebody that made wrestling fun, somebody that made wrestling incredible. So it's very difficult to disagree and argue with his picks. I would probably put The Rock in that list, maybe like top 5, top 6 of all time. Again, it boils down to the different generations. It depends on who you grew up with. I'm sure somebody that grew up on Jim Londos would say that he's the greatest of all time. You know what I'm saying? Jim Londos, guys like guys like, again, Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, guys like Lou Thez, Luthez, one of the greatest NWA champions of all time. You know what I'm saying? Even before that, way back in the early 1900s, guys like, the guys like Gotch and Hackenschmidt, those kind of guys that were, I mean, those guys are legends amongst legends. They're legends amongst legends amongst legends. I mean, those guys to me are the true legendary figures in wrestling. Like the first world champion, the first recognized wrestling champion of all time, guys like a Hackenschmidt, those kind of guys. From like the early 1900s, like way back in the day. The 1910s or the 1920s or whatever, like the way back. To me, those guys are the true legendary figures in wrestling because they go all the way back. They were the best in their time. They were the greatest in their time. And that was at a time when it's like you had to be legit. You had to have some shooting skills. You had to have some amateur skills, or not even amateur skills, but that ability to put somebody in submission. To put a legitimate submission move on somebody so that you could protect the business. Those guys to me, that catch as catch can style, that very guys like Stu Hart, that ability to put somebody in a hold and make them really cry in pain, legitimately, so that they could protect the business. Yeah, to me, those guys are the real legends in wrestling. And so I think it largely has everything to do with who you grew up with back in when you were younger, when you were in your teenage years, and when you were young watching wrestling. Those are the kind of guys that you would kind of gravitate around and see as, oh, this guy's the best in the world. You know what I'm saying? Because you don't know the previous generation. I'm sure that somebody like The Rock, I'm sure he would hear about he'd hear about Bruno Sammartino. He'd hear about certain guys from the 1960s and 1970s, but he really wasn't there. Maybe in the 70s he was already, but he grew up on guys like The Rock. He grew up on guys like Hogan and Ric Flair. He's got a lot of respect for Austin because he was there with him. But it's it's his opinion, it's his point of view, but he wasn't there in the 1950s, 1940s, 1920s, 1930s. He wasn't there in the 1960s. So The Rock wouldn't know much about that era of wrestling because he wasn't alive to see it. But now, in my generation, I mean, I grew up on YouTube. Well, not grew up on YouTube. YouTube started when I was 18, technically, so I was already an adult when YouTube started. But I'm talking about as far as the modern generation now. You can watch YouTube clips of certain past wrestlers. People like a superstar Billy Graham, and wrestling from the 1970s, even a little bit from the 1960s. And you got all this information, and I'm learning about guys like Jim Londos. Guys from the past. That's kind of cool. So at least somebody like me who's relatively younger than The Rock's generation, I mean, I grew up in the 90s, The Rock grew up in the 1970s and early 1980s. So, what I'm saying, my generation, The Rock's generation are very different, but that kind of information wasn't that easily available back in his time. So, you're only able to know who's the greatest during your period of who's relevant at the time. So people who grew up on Hogan, all they know is Hogan. People who grew up on Ric Flair in the 80s, all they know is Ric Flair. You know what I'm saying? But now it's we got all this historical stuff. You can look stuff up on Wikipedia. Who was the biggest drawing star of the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and so on and so on and so forth. So it's very cool to kind of figure out, oh, this guy was the biggest star back in the day. Ricky Dozan was the biggest star in Japanese wrestling back in the 1950s, 1960s. You know what I'm saying? So these guys from the past that were big stars, they were very important for the growth of the business. So it's very hard to gauge who is the greatest. It's extremely difficult because every generation, every decade has their, biggest stars. Every couple of stars, a couple of names that were outstanding back in the in their prime, back in the in their particular respective decade. So it's very hard to say, well, this is the top 3 greatest of all time. It's very difficult. It's very hard to gauge who is the greatest. I mean, you can have that argument of who is the greatest in the ring. That's another discussion altogether. Some people would use the in-ring ability as the #1 gauge for the best wrestler. Somebody might say, well, it's the Dynamite Kid, or Chris Benoit, or even somebody like Daniel Bryan. Oh, this guy's the greatest of all time, because when it comes to having a match, technically they had incredible style in the ring. They were so smooth and crisp, and the way that they performed the move. Or even somebody like a Luthez, Luthez, he invented so many different moves. I think he invented the power bomb, and I think the German suplex, certain moves that were like credited to Luthez. Like, this guy invented the power bomb. Like, oh my God, he came up with that move. Everybody uses the power. Like, it's become this common move, but like he came up with that. He came up with that move. Like, he was the first guy that's credited as doing it, or at least like really popularizing it. So it's hard to gauge who is the greatest of all time if you want to talk about the popularity compared to in-ring ability, and somebody who's innovative, somebody who brought so many new things to wrestling, like a Luthez, or somebody like a Hayabusa, or even somebody like Kenta. Kenta invented so many moves. He created so many. He created a go to sleep and different kick combinations and the running knee strike. That Daniel Bryan has been using for many years. And I know a lot of people will probably never agree that Kenta is the greatest of all time. Like, I'm sure, because he's a smaller name from Japan, and he never really made it in WWE. He failed in WWE as Hideo Itami, but it's like he was so influential as an in-ring innovator. It's crazy. He's had so many good matches in the indies, and in overseas, in Japan, and in Ring of Honor and stuff like that. Like, he had some really, really classic matches, but he completely flopped in WWE. So I guess it just depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a sports entertainer that is like incredible charismatic wise and incredible promo wise, then yeah, somebody like a Hogan would be up there. Somebody like a Macho Man would be up there. Somebody like a Ric Flair or Stone Cold and Rock. But then if you compare it to somebody who's like a great in-ring performer, and then you see guys like Will Ospreay and Ricochet in the ring nowadays, that's like incredible. Even somebody like, I don't even want to put him in that category, but Johnny Gargano has had classic matches. Or somebody like Kenny Omega or Kazuchika Okada. These guys that are like in the ring, they have so many different moves and so many classic matches, I guess, just in terms of high spots and strong style kind of matches. That's like long matches of attrition, and like they put on these lengthy, incredible matches. But it's like they're missing so many other things. They're missing that larger-than-life personality. They're missing charisma. They're missing mic skills, especially somebody like a Johnny Gargano and Ricochet. And it's like, it depends. It depends on what you're looking for. But I think for the most part, when it comes to wrestling, because wrestling at the end of the day is very sports entertainment. It's a fictional, fake world. You would tend to look more for the entertainer. Somebody like a Hogan, Randy Savage, Ric Flair, somebody who is very, very charismatic, somebody who's funny, somebody who can talk and have that ability to draw you in, suck you into the match, and pull you into their storyline, pull you into their narrative, pull you into their world, into their universe, just by talking, just by having good mic skills. I think people tend to look for that more, and having a great look, like having that physical charisma, looking like a star, looking like an interesting, unique, almost like a celebrity, looking like a celebrity type of superstar. So Hogan would be up there, guys like The Rock would be up there, Austin, guys that have a unique look. I've even spoken to people that would say CM Punk is a GOAT. CM Punk is one of the greatest of all time, if not the greatest of all time. Now, I've heard some people say that. I've heard some people say that CM Punk is the best of all time, the greatest wrestler of all time. And for them, he is. Because they like his mic skills. He's very confident and very comfortable on the mic. He's very calm. He's not, he's not necessarily like yelling. He doesn't really have a character per se. He's got that natural likable, very articulate, and very well-spoken kind of guy. You know, he talks like a normal guy, but he's very articulate, and he gets his points across really, really well. You know, he's, you know, in his prime, he was kind of a young, handsome guy with long hair. You know, he looked like a Hollywood actor. You know, like a good-looking Hollywood celebrity. And he had some pretty good gimmicks. You know, I thought the Straight Edge Society was his best work. You know, the SES, he did some good stuff there, and he was a very good villain. That stable, that little group that he had, that was really interesting. He had some good ideas. He did tremendous work with the pipe bomb and all that. He influenced this reality era, no doubt about it, with the pipe bomb and having a more realistic shoot-based type of promo. You know, his in-ring matches have been really, really solid. You know, his matches against John Cena and against Brock Lesnar. And Chris Jericho, those kind of guys, like CM Punk would be considered a really solid in-ring performer. You know what I'm saying? He didn't necessarily look like a bodybuilder, but you know, he had tattoos and all that, so he looked more like an alternative, like a punk rocker, you know, or something like that, some kind of musician, like a rock star from the 2000s. You know, so some people look at CM Punk as the best of all time. You know, he's definitely one of the most influential and definitely one of the most impactful wrestlers of the 2010s for sure. He definitely had a lot of success, especially at a time it was like PG era, and you know, he stood out a lot in the PG era. He made the PG era very noteworthy, as far as being the guy who tells the truth, the guy who speaks he speaks his mind, and having that the in-ring ability to back it up. You know, maybe he's kind of overhyped in some instances. Maybe he's a little overrated, but I mean, who isn't overrated? You know, you can make an argument for anybody to be overrated and overhyped. You know, The Rock can be overrated. Stone Cold can be overrated. Hulk Hogan can be overrated. You know, everybody can be overrated, because some people are looking for certain things. They're looking for in-ring ability. They're looking for body. They're looking for somebody who's got huge muscles. They're looking for good looks. They're looking for incredible, undeniable charisma. You know, some people out there, they look at Bret Hart as the best of all time. You know, Bret Hart, I think, is the greatest wrestler of all time. You know, but Bret Hart wasn't the most charismatic. He didn't have like the greatest mic skills. Even back in his prime as a microphone guy back in 1997, you know, he had some good promos, but he was never like this like super incredible personality. He was more kind of down to earth with his promo skills. He was more like realistic based, you know. He wasn't larger than life the way that Hogan was, which I think why, you know, Hogan was such a big draw, and Bret was a decent draw, but he wasn't as big and famous as Hogan. So, you know, I think it just depends on what you're. Somebody would look at, my God, I mean, people would say that Shawn Michaels is the best of all time, you know, the GOAT, HBK, and I think in the ring, charisma-wise, you know, microphone skills-wise, an overall in-ring performer, Shawn is up there, no doubt, top 10. He's top 10. You can make an argument for him being number one. I think the biggest drawback about Shawn is that he was never the biggest drawing wrestler in history. You know, he was a far cry from guys like Hogan, you know, guys like Andre the Giant, you know, even guys like Rock and Austin. He was never like he was never super huge and super popular that everybody knew him. You know, he was popular enough where, like in the wrestling world, people recognize and have a lot of respect for his ability, and people would look at him as one of the greatest in-ring performers of all time, kind of like The Undertaker, but it's like, he was never that big of a crossover star, you know, unfortunately. It's not like, you know, he became a movie star, or he never did stuff outside of WWE, and he was never this huge drawing, you know, superstar. You know, he was a big enough star, but he was never... He wasn't as big as The Rock or Austin or Hogan, unfortunately. And, you know, for whatever reason, whether it's because he was too much of a pretty boy, he looked too much like a... He looked too much like a... God, he didn't have that hyper-masculine crossover appeal. He wasn't like this super macho kind of guy. Like, he wasn't like super interesting for a lot of men. You know, like for a lot of girls, they thought he was hot. He had the long hair. He was a pretty boy, but he's like, like he's dancing too much. He's a little too, like he's too, he's for girls. You know, he's a character for girls, and yeah, like he's charismatic, but he's I don't like his gimmick. You know, I don't like his character. He's too, he caters too much to women. You know, he doesn't have that alpha male feel to him. He doesn't have that Austin, you know, anti-hero, you know, feel to him. He doesn't have that funny jock, you know, rock persona. He doesn't have that incredible superhero feel to him like Hulk Hogan, you know. I think HBK was more of a, well, he was, in some ways, he was just a male, almost like a male go-go dancer. So you could only get popular with men for a certain, you know, certain point. He was never that crossover guy, so. You know, but definitely in the ring and then, you know, having that mic skills, HBK was tremendous. So, that's my opinion about this particular article. Got a lot of responses, but that's my opinion. And again, it's very hard to find, very hard to gauge who is the top 3 of all time. The Rock gave his opinion, Ric Flair, Austin, and Hogan. I can understand why he did it, but, you know, it's very debatable. Very debatable. So that's it for this episode of the Review Space. Thank you guys for watching. Check out the channel for more wrestling videos and topics. Subscribe and click on the bell button. The bell button. Click on the bell button for the latest notifications. And until next time, peace.